The Atlantic Ocean in 1942 was not a battlefield with trenches or borders. It was a moving, shifting void of cold water, fog, and silence, where death traveled invisibly beneath the waves. German U-boats hunted there like submerged predators, slipping between shipping lanes and striking without warning. Every week, Allied cargo ships vanished beneath the surface, taking food, fuel, ammunition, and thousands of sailors with them. Britain was slowly being strangled, not by bombs over cities, but by steel beneath the sea. The enemy could not be seen, only felt. Distress signals crackled over the radio, then went quiet forever. Oil slicks and floating debris were often the only evidence that a ship had ever existed. The ocean swallowed everything else. Allied naval commanders understood the brutal truth. Surface warships could not protect every convoy. The Atlantic was too vast. The U-boats were too many. What they needed was not more ships, but eyes that could search the endless water for something that did not belong. That was where the flying boats came in. Among them was the PBY Catalina, a large, slow, ungainly aircraft that could land on open ocean and stay in the air for more than 15 hours. It was not designed to fight. It was designed to endure. But endurance was exactly what the war at sea demanded. From isolated coastal bases, Catalina crews began flying into the emptiness, scanning the surface for the smallest sign of a German submarine. They did not know where the enemy would appear. They only knew that if they failed to find them, more ships would die. And somewhere far out in the Atlantic, a single U-boat was already on the surface, unaware that its hunters were coming. The PBY Catalina was never meant to duel with warships. It had no armor worth mentioning, no speed to escape danger, and no graceful lines of fighter. Its wings were long and heavy, its engines loud, and its silhouette unmistakable against the sky. To most pilots, it looked more like a floating warehouse than a weapon. Yet in the silent war over the ocean, it became something far more dangerous than its appearance suggested. Inside the Catalina, the crew lived in constant tension. A single mission could last half a day, sometimes longer. The roar of engines never stopped. The smell of fuel mixed with sweat and salt air. Each man had a station, but all of them watched the sea, waiting for the one thing that would turn boredom into terror. A dark line on the water that did not move with the waves. That line meant a U-boat. When a submarine was on the surface, it was at its most vulnerable. It needed to recharge batteries and take in fresh air, and during those moments it could be spotted from the sky. The Catalina was slow, but it could approach quietly from low altitude, staying just above the ocean where clouds and haze hid it from view. Once the crew saw a U-boat, everything changed. Radios came alive. Bomb doors opened. Gunners took their positions. What had been a long patrol suddenly became a race against time, because a submarine could disappear beneath the waves in seconds. The Catalina had only one chance to strike before the enemy vanished. And on this day, far from land, that chance was about to arrive. The U-boat surfaced just after dawn, cutting through the gray Atlantic like a steel knife. Its crew had been underwater for nearly 2 days, running silent to avoid Allied patrols. Inside the submarine, the air was stale, thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Batteries were running low. The men were exhausted. They needed air, power, and a few moments of calm before returning to the depths. On the bridge, lookouts scanned the horizon. The ocean appeared empty. No ships, no aircraft, only endless waves and a pale sky. The commander gave the order to begin recharging. Engines roared to life, and the submarine settled into a steady surface run, completely exposed. Above them, almost invisible against the clouds, a Catalina was already approaching. The flying boat's crew had spotted the submarine as a faint dark shape against the water. At first it looked like a trick of the light, but binoculars confirmed it. A German U-boat, alone, hundreds of miles from land. For the Catalina crew, this was the moment they had trained for. For the men on the submarine, it was a moment they did not yet know existed. The pilot reduced throttle and brought the aircraft down closer to the waves, using the glare of the rising sun to hide his approach. Every second mattered. If the U-boat saw them early, it would dive and disappear. The Catalina had to get close enough to attack before that could happen. Inside the aircraft, the crew grew silent. Bomb racks were armed. Depth charges waited beneath the fuselage. Ahead, the dark shape on the water grew larger. Somewhere below, a German sailor finally looked up and saw death coming from the sky. The warning came too late. A shout echoed across the U-boat's deck as one of the lookouts pointed skyward. Against the pale morning clouds, the silhouette of the Catalina was suddenly visible, descending fast and low. Alarms blared through the submarine. Men scrambled for their stations. The calm of the open sea vanished, replaced by chaos and urgency. "Aircraft," someone yelled. "Dive! Dive!" The captain hesitated for only a second. If the boat dived immediately, it might escape, but the Catalina was already dangerously close. If they waited even briefly, the enemy could strike. He ordered the anti-aircraft gun to open fire while the boat prepared to submerge. The deck gun swiveled upward and began spitting tracer rounds into the sky. Bright streaks raced toward the incoming aircraft. Inside the Catalina, the cockpit shook as bullets tore through the air around them. The gunners fired back, streams of machine gun fire hammering the submarine's deck. Water churned as the U-boat began to sink lower, its bow dipping beneath the waves. The Catalina flew straight into the storm of fire, refusing to turn away. The bombardier watched the submarine through his sight, counting seconds, waiting for the exact moment when the boat was deep enough that depth charges would crush it, but not so deep that it could escape. Smoke drifted across the cockpit. The aircraft was taking hits, but the pilot held his course, lining the Catalina up directly over the fading outline of the submarine. Below, the U-boat was slipping into the sea. Above, the flying boat was descending into hell. The next few seconds would decide which machine would survive and which would be lost to the Atlantic forever. The first shell struck the Catalina's wing with a violent jolt, ripping through metal and fuel lines. A second hit followed almost immediately. In an instant, flames erupted along the aircraft's side, fed by leaking aviation fuel. Black smoke poured into the sky, marking the Catalina like a beacon. Inside the cabin, the crew felt the heat and smelled burning metal. Someone shouted that the wing was on fire. Another crewman began to cough as smoke filled the narrow interior. Any ordinary pilot would have broken away, turned toward the horizon, and tried to save the aircraft. But this was no ordinary moment. Below them, the U-boat was still not fully submerged. The pilot stared straight ahead, gripping the controls with white-knuckled hands. He knew what the flames meant. The aircraft would not survive long. But he also knew something else. If he turned away now, the submarine would dive and escape, free to kill again. The men on the U-boat were firing desperately, trying to finish off the Catalina before it could strike. Bullets tore through the fuselage. One engine sputtered. Warning lights flashed. Yet the flying boat kept descending, burning, shaking, but still on course. In the bombardier's position, the crosshairs stayed locked on the shadow of the U-boat just beneath the waves. Depth charges were armed. All that remained was timing. The aircraft was now so low that sea spray brushed its belly. Flames licked across the wing. The Catalina was dying, but it was dying on its own terms. As the submarine slipped deeper into the water, the pilot gave a single, quiet order over the intercom. Release. The bombs began to fall. The depth charges dropped from the Catalina in a heavy, unstoppable line, plunging into the Atlantic just above the fading shadow of the U-boat. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The sea closed over the falling weapons, as if swallowing them whole. Then the ocean itself exploded. Massive columns of white water and foam burst upward, dwarfing both the submarine and the aircraft above it. The shockwaves slammed into the U-boat's hull with crushing force. Inside, steel plates bent and seams tore apart. Lights went out. Men were thrown from their stations as freezing water poured in through ruptured bulkheads. The submarine tried to dive, but it was already mortally wounded. Its engines failed. Its hull cracked. In less than a minute, The U-boat began to sink uncontrollably, dragged downward by the weight of the sea and the damage inflicted from above. No distress call was sent. There was no time. Above the blast, the Catalina flew through a cloud of spray and smoke. The explosions rocked the aircraft violently. Flames spread further along its wing. One engine finally gave out completely, its propellers slowing to a useless stop. The crew felt the aircraft begin to lose lift. Below them, the water closed over the U-boat. The last trace of the German submarine vanished into the dark depths, taking its entire crew with it. The enemy had been destroyed, but victory had come at a terrible price. The Catalina was no longer under control. Fire consumed its structure, and the damaged wing could no longer hold the weight of the aircraft. The flying boat began a slow, unstoppable descent toward the same ocean it had just turned into a weapon. Now it was their turn to fall. The Catalina could no longer stay in the air. One wing was burning, the other was riddled with holes, and only a single engine was still producing power. The aircraft listed to the side, losing altitude with every passing second. Inside the cabin, the crew braced themselves as alarms screamed and the roar of the dying engine echoed through the metal frame. Smoke made it hard to breathe. The heat was unbearable near the burning wing. Some of the men knew what was coming. There was no safe place to land, no friendly ship in sight, and no time to send a proper message. The Atlantic stretched endlessly below them, dark and cold, waiting. The pilot tried to level the aircraft, hoping to make a controlled water landing. But the damage was too severe. Control surfaces barely responded. The Catalina shuddered as it dropped lower, the surface of the sea rushing up to meet it. For a moment, there was a strange calm. The U-boat was gone. The mission was complete. They had won. Then the water struck. The flying boat slammed into the ocean at high speed. The impact tore the weakened structure apart. Fuel ignited on contact, and a violent explosion ripped through what remained of the aircraft. Fire and steam filled the air as wreckage scattered across the waves. In seconds, the Catalina was gone. There were no survivors, no rafts, no voices calling for help. Only burning debris and spreading oil marked the place where a crew of airmen had just sacrificed their lives. Above the water, the smoke drifted away. Below it, two enemies now lay together on the ocean floor, locked in a final, silent grave. When the last flames faded, the Atlantic returned to what it had been before the battle, a wide, empty wilderness of moving water. There were no witnesses left. No voices remained to describe what had just happened. Only wreckage and oil floated where two war machines had destroyed each other. Hours later, an Allied convoy passed through the area. Sailors on deck noticed a dark slick on the waves and pieces of twisted metal rising and falling with the swell. They did not know what it was at first. There was no radio distress call, no signal flare, no coordinates had been transmitted. Whatever had happened here, it had happened in complete isolation. A small patrol vessel was sent to investigate. The crew found fragments of aircraft skin, bits of wiring, and a single piece of scorched fabric. Nearby, there were bubbles rising from the water, faint and irregular, marking where something very heavy had sunk to the bottom. The officers understood what it meant. A battle had taken place, and both sides had lost everything. The incident was recorded in a brief line in the operations log. There were no names, no stories, just cold numbers. Enemy submarine destroyed. Friendly aircraft lost. That was all history would say. But beneath that simple sentence lay an act of extraordinary sacrifice. A Catalina crew had chosen to continue their attack while their aircraft burned, knowing that they would not survive. They had traded their own lives to ensure that the U-boat could never hunt again. The Atlantic swallowed their bodies, their aircraft, and their enemy, leaving only silence behind. In the weeks that followed, no one spoke about the battle. There were no headlines, no public announcements, and no medals handed out in ceremonies. The war at sea was too vast, and losses were too frequent. One more aircraft and one more submarine disappearing into the Atlantic barely registered beyond a few lines in classified reports. Yet the impact of what had happened was far greater than it seemed. That single U-boat would never again stalk convoys. It would never fire another torpedo into a ship filled with civilians, food, or soldiers bound for Europe. Dozens of cargo vessels that would have been sunk in the following months instead reached their destination safely. Thousands of men who would have drowned in the cold Atlantic lived because that submarine had been stopped. The Catalina crew never knew this. They did not see the ships they saved. They did not hear the engines of convoys that passed through the waters they had cleared. Their sacrifice was invisible, buried beneath waves and sealed inside forgotten files. But in naval headquarters, analysts began to notice something changing. U-boat losses were rising. Allied shipping losses were falling. Long-range patrol aircraft, especially the flying boats, were slowly breaking the German stranglehold on the sea. Every destroyed submarine shifted the balance a little further. The war in the Atlantic was not won by a single massive battle, but by countless small, brutal encounters like this one, where isolated crews met in the middle of nowhere and fought to the death. Each one was a tiny piece of a much larger turning point. And somewhere on the ocean floor, the Catalina and the U-boat lay together, silent witnesses to that change. The Atlantic never built monuments for the dead. There were no crosses or stones to mark where the Catalina fell, and no grave to show where the U-boat vanished. The ocean kept everything, erasing the violence with time, waves, and salt. But history remembers what the water hides. The battle between the flying boat and the submarine was only one of many, yet it represented the strange new kind of warfare that had emerged in the 20th century. Machines of the air and machines of the deep had collided in a place where neither truly belonged. A slow, vulnerable aircraft had destroyed a deadly predator of the sea, not through strength, but through persistence and courage. The men in the Catalina had not been heroes in the way people imagine. They were tired, cold, and afraid, flying endless patrols over empty water. But when a moment came, they did not turn away. They chose to finish their mission, even when their own survival was no longer possible. The U-boat crew, too, were gone, swallowed by the same ocean they had used as a weapon. War had taken them all, leaving no victors, only consequences. Years later, the Atlantic became peaceful again. Ships crossed it in safety. The supply lines that once bled now flowed freely. Few remember the exact place where the two machines met and destroyed each other. But in that unseen grave beneath the waves, a flying boat and a submarine still rest together, marking a point where sky and sea once clashed, and where human lives were spent to change the course of a war.